Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Beirut is Habib Battah. He's an independent journalist and the editor of BeirutReport.com. With us from Erbil in Iraq is Ahmed Rushdi. He's a senior foreign policy advisor to the Iraqi parliament. Mohammad Marandi heads the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. And Abdel Bari Atwan is editor-in-chief of al-Youm, a London-based Arabic news site. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Abdel Bari Atwan, let me start with you. We've seen this wave of unrest and demonstrations in many Middle Eastern countries, in Iraq, in Iran, in Lebanon, even in Jordan. What's behind it? Why have so many people taken to the streets in the region?
Actually, because the people are fed up of the government, the regime there. They are corrupt, mainly sectarian, and they are actually using the bad governance or imposing actually the bad governance. And the standard of living is extremely shooting up in most of these countries. So people would like change. People, they are not looking for democracy as it used to be in the previous or the first wave of Arab Spring. No. Now they are looking for the good governance. They are looking for the root out of corruption and corrupted people. And also, they are calling for the wealth of the country to be justly distributed, not actually to be in the hands of few people, few businessmen, few actually corrupt officials in this government. So that's actually the description of the situation now. We can see Lebanon, for example, which is a small country with about 4 million population. They got the debts of at least $100 billion. If you look at Jordan, again, a small country, a population of 8 million, and the debt is more than $42 billion. Iraq, which is supposed to be one of the wealthiest Arab countries, at least $600 billion were stolen, and the people actually who are supposed to present a good example to the Iraqi people after the fallout or the disposition of Saddam Hussein, look at them. You know, the country is fifth of the population under the poverty line, and also you can see it is a sectarian regime,
right.
And most of the people there are suffering from poverty, from the unemployment.
Mohammad Marandi, that was a formidable array of problems that Abdel Bari Atwan was telling us about there. But let's look at the situation in Iran. What started out as a protest against gas prices going up has now led into widespread demonstrations in the country. In fact, according to the government, 200,000 people have taken to the streets, 180 people have been killed, 7,000 have been arrested. Where do you see this going in Iran? Is it going to continue?
Well, I think you have to make a distinction between the protesters, which came out when the government increased the price of gasoline dramatically, and the rioters. There were no deaths during the protests. The protests took place on day one. They ended peacefully, but late in the day, there were suddenly large numbers of riots across the country, almost simultaneously, and they were being egged on both by Persian language media outlets that are funded by the West, like BBC Persian, VOA Persian, and a number of other outlets supported by the US government. And foreign intelligence services, according to the Iranians, were behind many of the teams that were carrying out attacks on banks, ambulances. They attacked refineries. They attacked fuel storages, depots, right, and also Iran's strategic reserves. So these had nothing to do with the demonstrations. But the interesting thing is that foreign Western powers are conflating the rioters with the protesters. They had nothing to do with one another. In fact, during the riots, a number of police officers were murdered in the different provinces. So I think we have to make a distinction between what's going on in Iraq and Lebanon and other countries and in Iran, especially since foreign powers are trying to undermine Iran, and Iran has no foreign debts.
Right. Mohammad Marandi, you make the point that there are protesters and there are rioters, and the fact that there is foreign interference, foreign manipulation, as you've just told us a minute ago. But the protesters who are on the streets, they have genuine grievances, don't they?
Absolutely, yes, because in my personal opinion, the Rouhani administration made a serious mistake in suddenly increasing the price of fuel and to such a large degree, to such a huge rise, and without telling people beforehand. We woke up in the morning and suddenly we saw the price of gasoline had increased substantially, and this is at a time when the United States is waging economic warfare against Iranians. The government has legitimate reasons for increasing the price, but they surprised everyone. They did not explain to the public what they were going to do with the money. The government later on said that they were going to return all of the money that they obtained from the increase in price to 70% of the population, which receives lower wages. But whether this actually happens or not, or it is carried out in an effective way, we have to wait and see. But still, people were caught off guard and people were very angry.
Okay, let me go to Ahmed Rushdi. Ahmed Rushdi, in Iraq, we've seen some of the most horrific protests and the response by the government. Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi has resigned. That follows weeks of protests. It's left hundreds of people dead. In fact, the protesters have been demonstrating against corruption, the failure of public services, high unemployment in the country. They're also against the current political system. They want the political system in Iraq changed. What can you tell us about these protests and the manner in which the government has responded to it?
Well, Anand, thank you very much for hosting me. For the protesters, you know, the 1st of October was something magnificent in the Iraqi politics. It's the first time in 16 years all the Iraqis actually become united against corruption, against unemployment, and also against poor services. Not in the beginning, they were only want those files to be managed, to be reformed by the Iraqi government. No one asked for the resignation of the prime minister. But the problem is that the government and also the political blocs didn't understand how much the Iraqi people suffer and how much it is deep in the heart of the Iraqis. Then it becomes the 25th of October, the second wave of demonstrations, which actually pushed hard to make a loss like 400 dead men and women, especially in the southern governorates, with casualties about 12,000 and with detainees about 7,000 to 8,000, was something very horrible. I think with the presence of the Marja'iyya, pushed hard to make the resignation of the prime minister. I don't think the prime minister actually wanted to resign. It is the pressure by the Marja'iyya, it is the pressure by the demonstrations that pushed him to resign. Then that means we have a negative impact of the whole political process on the Iraqis, which means that the Iraqis now seeing the political process as some way of impairment of life, of the ordinary life of Iraqis. So that's why now, with the resignation, with the move of the parliament to make two main things, electoral law and the electoral committee law, which is a very important issue, to move to the second reform stage, which is the early elections.
Ahmed Rushdi, what about the 400 people who've been killed by security forces? Who's going to be held accountable for that?
Definitely. The Iraqi government, the former Iraqi government, the former prime minister should take the full responsibility for that. All the ministers should take the responsibility for that. He made some sort of investigation committee, which actually made a very untransparent report, which at the end refused by the UN, refused by the international community, even refused by some political blocs, saying that it is not right, this report is not right. This government, or let's say the former government, should take the full responsibility of those 400 people, and I think the next government will do so, will make the responsibility for the prime minister and the whole cabinet of the prime minister.
All right, let's go to Lebanon. Habib Battah, Lebanon has been in crisis for some time. We've seen a lot of demonstrations there after the government tried to impose taxes on tobacco, on gasoline, on internet telephone calls as well. Prime Minister Saeed Hariri has resigned, but what's happened in the country since then?
Well, the downtown Beirut, where I'm talking to you right now today, is still occupied by protesters. It's an extraordinary scene. They have been holding streets and highways like never before. People are really fed up, as your guests have said, but I don't think that the problem can always be blamed on the people or the rioters or what kind of technique people use. At the end of the day, we have to look at who's making money in these societies. There's a huge income gap. We have less than 0.1% of people in Lebanon. There's 3,000 persons who own 50% of the country's wealth. So there is a massive disconnect here between the leadership in these countries and the people. The leadership, no matter what their party or what country they're in, surround themselves with businessmen. These countries are basically ruled by businessmen. And it's not just the Middle East. I think it's really odd that we always call this an Arab Spring. I mean, this is happening. There are dozens of countries around the world, in South America and other parts of the world, where people are revolting because of unequal income distribution, vastly unequal income distribution today. It's neoliberal economic policies that have allowed the markets and businessmen to run these countries and to privatize so many things in society.
Yeah, and we are seeing that in other parts of the world as well. Abdel Bari Atwan, Habib just mentioned the Arab Spring there. Some analysts and commentators are comparing what is happening now to the Arab Spring. One analyst said that, in fact, the Arab Spring didn't die, it just became dormant. It was overtaken by the brutality of events in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, for example. Do you agree with that?
I do agree, but I have a different point of view a bit. You know, if we look at the first wave of the Arab Spring, we can see it didn't succeed in all of these countries, except Tunisia, which I was visiting just last week. So you can see what is happening in Egypt. It is the military who is taking over. If you look at for example, Sudan, still it is very big. If you look at you know, Syria, there is a war there, and more than 500,000 people were killed in this war. But you know, what I would like to refer to is the military intervention. It's you know, money were poured for example, in Syria to create this so-called revolution there, and you can see the same thing now. There is a lot of you know, fingers, outside fingers. Maybe American fingers actually in interfering in the situation in Iran and also in Iraq, in a way or another in Syria, because we have to remember that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, said we will actually take the problems to Iran. We take the war to Iran. We want to undermine the regime from inside. So I wouldn't be surprised, actually, there are some sort of foreign interventions in these kind of revolutions. I believe Arab worlds are frustrated. People are frustrated in the street. They thought that the regime now will learn the lessons of the first wave of the Arab Spring and reform their government, produce more democracy, more human rights, more social justice. But unfortunately, they failed to do so. And I believe this what is happening in a way or another is some sort of you know, reform of the first wave of the Arab Spring. You know, sort of actually recorrection of some mistakes which took place. But I believe in the end, I think we will see actually some sort of a good governance in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Sudan, and most of the Arab countries. I am absolutely optimistic when it comes to the change. I believe the change is coming, and I believe this could be the end of the foreign intervention of the affairs of the Middle Eastern countries.
Mohammad Marandi, when we look at the challenges that Iran faces right now, demonstrators on the streets, the response by the government, how big are those challenges, and what does the government do? Does it simply accept the fact that Iran is now in a beleaguered situation, it's facing challenges and pressures from the outside, including sanctions from the United States, or does it make an attempt to reach out diplomatically, politically, to I guess, its enemies in the world to ease those sanctions?
No, I don't think that in Iran the major issue is Iran's foreign policy. In fact, according to polls taken by different institutions, most Iranians agree in general with Iran's foreign policy. The problem, I think, is economic policy. As your guest in Lebanon said, the current administration, merits aside, this administration has been pursuing liberal economic policies. And I think that has harmed Iranian society, especially since after the Iranian Revolution, one of the key slogans was always social justice, supporting the oppressed, the downtrodden, and so on. But now we have policies that have been in place for especially the last few years that have benefited the wealthy. I think now, after the United States began its economic warfare against Iranians and the Iranian people and the Iranian government, this administration is trying to shift a bit away from liberal economic policies, but I think it's too little and too late. And in my opinion, the administration is going to lose heavily in the upcoming parliamentary elections in 3-4 months from now. And I think probably if things continue as they a sort of leftist-leaning president will come to power in a year and a half, and President Rouhani's economic policies, I think, have been very much discredited. So the major issue is, I think, social justice, issues of corruption, of course, which are always, in my opinion, deeply linked to liberal economics, and this has to change. Of course, the situation in Iraq, I think, is very different. It's the country is extremely corrupt, but we also have to remember, as the previous guest rightly pointed out, that the Americans have been trying to manipulate these grievances, whether in North Africa or in West Asia, and they're doing so, the Americans and their allies, today as well. But the corruption of the Iraqi government, regardless of what the Americans are doing, is extraordinary, because the country is producing over 5 million barrels a day of oil. But I've just visited Iraq a few weeks ago. I was there for a week, and the poverty is extraordinary.
Ahmed Rushdi, in Iraq, one of the big demands by the protesters is a change in the type of government, in the way people are elected in the country. Under the current system, certain groups are allocated certain seats of power. Do you see that changing?
Yeah, definitely. Now there is a huge pressure on the parliament to make those two laws that I mentioned before, electoral law and the electoral committee law, because the electoral law actually is for the favorability of the political blocs. It's not on the individual level, it's on the political blocs level. So now it's changing because of the pressure that made by the protesters, that made by the Marja'iyya, to change it on individual level. And also, there is very important issue is that we all making, as the electoral law before, it was on one circle, making the governorate or the province as one circle. Now it's supposed to be multiple circles. That means there will be more representation for the individualism inside the Iraqi parliament. The second thing is that the electoral committee, which always have been smashed as it is corrupted. They are made so many fraudulent in the numbers, especially in the previous elections. Now there are talks that maybe we can make it all of them judges, or maybe all of them academics, specialized in law, and so on. So there is a progress inside the parliament, not because the parliament wants that, but because the pressure is already on the parliament to move out with those two important laws and go forward for early elections, because it's supposed to be in about, let's say, 45 days, there will be a new government, and the new government will make early, or will decline, or maybe will announce early elections in about, let's say, 4 or 5 months, maybe either in April or maybe a maximum for September, for next September. So that's why, at the end, the parliament has a huge pressure. It is made by the people, and already there will be a change. I'm not talking dramatic changes, but at least there will be a hope in a new government that really representative by the parliament, and the parliament is really representative by the people.
Okay. Habib Battah, in Lebanon, we saw that sectarian war in the 70s and 80s that ended in 1990. And, Lebanon is made of people who are Sunni, who are Shiite, who are Christians. Looking at the current unrest in the country, is there any sectarian element to it, or do these demonstrations and grievances transcend any divisions in the country, religious divisions?
Well, I mean, that's been one of the most exciting parts about all of this. It is about democracy. It's not just about economic issues. It's also about the fact that our government is ruled by a group of men who come from the same families, feudal families, not just sectarian families, that have basically run this country for the last 50 to 100 years. So there's a lot of pressure now to change that system. And what's fascinating about all this is that people have been organizing in the squares right behind me along a non-sectarian basis. You know, politics in Lebanon has always been about what your last name is, what your ideology is. And nowadays, people are actually, organizing around issues like why is there no electricity? Why is there no water? Why do we have the most expensive phone bills in the world? Why do we have the most expensive electric bills in the world? So people are actually talking about citizen-based, like issue-based politics for the first time instead of these parties, which have been entirely corrupted. And by the way, I mean, we can talk about the United States' role, and that's very important to talk about that. We can also talk about the other countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, who also put a lot of money and power behind these corrupt individuals in this country. And so there's an international thing happening in Lebanon. It's not just the civil. It's not just the civil war. I don't believe it was civil or sectarian. It was also an international war where all countries of the world supplied weapons to Lebanon, and all the countries in the world have also been part of this post-war last 30 years in Lebanon, where we have been having this neoliberal policy,
right.
And also having all of these foreign countries putting money in. So we don't really decide. Lebanon doesn't always decide what its future is. The countries around it have a big role in that, from Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, France. All these countries really view Lebanon as kind of a chessboard, and they have been, really in cahoots with this leadership. So I think we need to really focus on democracy as a need. People don't really have that, even though it looks like democracy. It's not really that democratic when you have the same families in power, but people are actually challenging that today, and there are a lot of new groups forming on the streets today, and the media in Lebanon today is actually investigating corruption in ways they never had, talking about the prime minister and the president's family members and relatives and friends who have been getting all these contracts in the country for so many years. So we're seeing a real resurgence of questioning power, and not just kind of focusing on outside interference, but yes, definitely all of these ratings agencies and all of these international monetary institutions have put austerity measures on Lebanon. So it's not necessarily corruption. It's kind of like how the international markets work, where poor countries really get the short end of the stick.
Okay, Abdel Bari Atwan, time is catching up with us, but I do want to talk about Egypt. We haven't talked about Egypt. Foreign Policy magazine had a story on Egypt, and it said that the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is moving Egypt towards totalitarianism, more towards totalitarianism than ousted President Hosni Mubarak, and in the process, it's laying the groundwork for even more instability in the country. What do you make of that, and what's happening in Egypt right now?
Well, to be honest, I'm shocked to hear how the situation is deteriorating in Egypt when it comes to the human rights, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to the freedom of expression. For example, Egypt used to be actually the best when it comes to the media itself. The Egyptian media used to control most of the Arab countries. Now you can see the media actually in very bad situation. Freedom of expression means you have to, if you express your views, frankly, and in a free way, I think you will be arrested and thrown to the prison. We know a lot of academic, highly respected academic like Hassan Nafa, for example, the political, teacher or doctor in Cairo University. He is behind the bars now simply because he criticized the regime. So I think it is definitely a totalitarian regime. Definitely Egypt is losing, its image as a stabling country or a stable country in the whole of the Middle East, and it is really drastic. Egypt is, a leader of the Arab world, the leader of the Middle East. When it is in such a drastic situation, I think this will reflect badly in the most of the area.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.